Sometimes the most memorable stories in gacha games aren't the big world-shaping plotlines, they're the small ones, the quiet stories that focus on just one character, one emotional conflict, and one simple idea. Recently, while playing through some of the character stories in Arknights Endfield, that's exactly what happened to me. I played Levatane's story and then Yvonne's story right after that, and to my surprise, I ended up enjoying those small character stories more than the main narrative itself. Of course, that doesn't mean the main story is bad, but these smaller stories do something that a lot of large, complex narratives struggle with. They stay simple. Instead of juggling multiple factions, massive world building, and dozens of characters, they focus on a single emotional journey. And Yvonne's story is a perfect example of why that approach can be so effective. On the surface, it's a very simple story. It's about Yvonne dealing with the destruction of her creation, Tata, the machine that sacrificed itself to save Valley 4. There are no massive twists, no complicated plotline conflicts, just a character trying to process loss, guilt, and eventually learning how to move forward. And somehow that simplicity makes the story hit much harder than you might expect. So today I want to talk about why Yvonne's story works so well and why sometimes the simplest stories are the ones that leave the biggest emotional impact. One of the strangest things about large world-spanning narratives is that they often struggle to create the same emotional impact as much smaller stories. And that might sound counterintuitive at first. After all, main storylines usually have everything you would expect from a big narrative. Huge conflicts, important characters, massive stakes that could affect the entire world. But at the same time, those stories also have a lot of responsibilities. A main narrative has to introduce the setting, it has to explain the rules of the world, it needs to establish factions, conflict, histories, and the larger direction of the plot. And when a story is trying to do all of those things at once, the focus naturally becomes much broader. Instead of following one emotional thread, the narrative has to juggle multiple ideas at the same time. You might have a political conflict unfolding in one part of the story, a new character being introduced in another, and at the same time the story might also be explaining the lore of the world, setting up future plot lines, or hinting at mysteries that will only be explored much later. None of this is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, this kind of world building is often what makes large stories interesting in the first place, but the trade-off is that the emotional core of the narrative can sometimes become diluted. When the story constantly shifts between different characters, locations, and plot lines, it becomes harder for the audience to stay emotionally anchored to any single moment. And this is where smaller character stories often have a huge advantage, because they don't need to carry the weight of the entire world on their shoulders. They don't need to introduce 10 different characters or set up the next major arc of the story. Instead, they can focus on something much more specific, one character, one conflict, one emotional journey. And because the story stays focused on that single thread, the narrative can explore that conflict much more directly. The pacing becomes tighter, the emotional stakes become clearer, and the audience has much more time to connect with what the character is actually going through. This is exactly the kind of storytelling structure that Yvonne's character story uses. Instead of trying to expand the world or move the larger plot forward, the story focuses almost entirely on one thing: Yvonne dealing with the destruction of Tata, the machine she created, and the one that ultimately sacrificed itself to save Valley 4. And that simple emotional premise becomes the foundation for the entire story. Before looking at the events of the story itself, it's important to understand who Yvonne normally is as a character, because most of the time Yvonne isn't the kind of character you would associate with a heavy emotional story like this. She's usually presented as someone who is energetic, curious, and even a little unconventional. Despite being a scientist, she doesn't fit the typical image of the cold, purely academic researcher. She has a much more expressive personality, someone who approaches her work with creativity and curiosity rather than strict formality. She's fascinated by experimentation, new ideas, and the unknown. There's a sense of excitement in the way she approaches technology and research. In many ways, she feels like the kind of person who is always looking forward to the next discovery. And that's exactly why the tone of this story feels so different. Because when we see Yvonne here, that usual energy is mostly gone. Instead of the curious scientist excited about new possibilities, we see someone who is clearly trying to avoid something. At the center of Yvonne's story is a very simple emotional conflict. She is trying to deal with the loss of Tata. Tata wasn't just a machine that Yvonne built. Over time, it became something much more personal to her. It was her creation, something she spent time developing, teaching, and guiding. And when Valley 4 was in danger, Tata made a decision to sacrifice itself in order to save everyone. From the outside, that moment looks heroic, but for Yvonne, it's much more complicated than that, because she believes that the sacrifice happened because of her. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that Yvonne feels responsible for what happened. She was the one who fed Tata all the information about Valley 4, the people, the situation, the importance of the place. So when Tata chose to protect it, Yvonne can't help but feel like she indirectly pushed it towards that decision. The guilt becomes one of the biggest emotional barriers she has to deal with, and the way the story presents this conflict is actually very subtle. Yvonne doesn't openly talk about Tata very much. She avoids the subject, brushes it aside, and tries not to dwell on it too much. But that avoidance tells you everything you need to know. Instead of confronting the loss directly, she keeps it buried. And that reaction is very human. When people deal with grief or guilt, the first instinct often isn't acceptance, it's avoidance. It's easier to pretend something didn't happen than to confront the emotions that came with it. So for most of the story, Yvonne is stuck in that state. She knows what happened, she knows Tata is gone, but she hasn't really allowed herself to process that reality yet. That avoidance itself becomes part of the story, because it shows that even someone who normally approaches the world with curiosity and optimism can struggle when faced with a loss that feels deeply personal. And that emotional contrast between who Yvonne usually is and the state we see her in here is one of the things that makes this story hit much harder than you might expect, because this isn't a story about saving the world or defeating an enemy. It's about a character slowly coming to terms with loss, and that's exactly the kind of focused emotional journey that smaller character stories can explore much more effectively than large, sprawling narratives. What makes Yvonne's story work so well isn't just the conflict itself, it's how patiently the story builds towards its emotional resolution. Throughout most of the story, nothing particularly dramatic happens. There are no major twists, no large-scale conflicts, and no sudden revelations that changes everything. Instead, the narrative focuses on Yvonne slowly working through the emotions she has been trying to avoid. At first, she keeps her distance from the topic of Tata entirely. The loss is something she clearly doesn't want to talk about, and the story reflects that reluctance. Conversations drift away from the subject, and the emotional weight of what happened is quietly in the background. But over time, that tension begins to surface more clearly. The protagonist plays an important role in that process. Rather than forcing Yvonne to confront her feelings directly, they simply stay close to her throughout the journey, creating space for her to gradually open up. And that slow pacing is exactly what makes the emotional payoff work, because when the story finally reaches the moment where Yvonne acknowledges what happened, it doesn't feel rushed or forced, it feels like something she had to reach on her own. She begins to accept the reality of Tata's destruction. More importantly, she begins to let go of the guilt she has been carrying. For most of the story, she believed that Tata sacrificed itself because of the information she gave it about Valley 4, that her actions somehow pushed her creation towards that decision. But as the story progresses, it becomes clearer that Tata's choice wasn't something she forced, it was something Tata chose. That realization becomes a turning point. Instead of staying trapped in the guilt of the past, Yvonne begins to look forward again, and the story ends on a surprisingly hopeful note. Rather than simply accepting the loss and moving on, Yvonne decides to continue her work with a new goal, finding a way to bring Tata back into existence, not necessarily restoring it exactly as it was, but continuing the research that first brought it into being. That shift transforms the entire emotional tone of the story. What begins as a story about loss and guilt gradually becomes a story about acceptance and determination. And that's where the emotional impact really lands, because after spending so much of the story watching Yvonne avoid the topic, seeing her finally confront it and then choose to move forward hits much harder than you might expect from such a simple narrative. In fact, by the time the story reaches its conclusion, it delivers something that caught me a little off guard. It actually hit me emotionally much harder than I expected. Not because the story was complex, but because it was honest. And sometimes that's exactly what makes a story memorable. So why do those character stories often end up feeling more engaging than the main narrative? I think the biggest reason comes down to a very simple difference in storytelling priorities. Character stories are character first. The main story, on the other hand, it's mostly plot first. In Yvonne's story, everything revolves around her emotional journey. The story doesn't start by introducing a large conflict or explaining the world. It starts with the character and the emotional problem she's dealing with. Every scene in the story ties back to that central conflict. Her guilt over Tata, her avoidance of the topic, her struggle to come to terms with what happened. Even the protagonist's role in the story exists mainly to support that emotional journey. The narrative always stays focused on how Yvonne is processing that loss. And because of that focus, the emotional arc becomes very clear. You can follow exactly how her mindset changes from the beginning of the story to the end. At first, she avoids the subject entirely, then she begins to acknowledge what happened, and eventually she reaches a point where she can move forward again. The entire story is built around that progression. Now, the main story works very differently. Instead of focusing on a character emotional journey, the main narrative usually prioritizes the larger plot. It needs to introduce the world, it needs to establish the political situation, the technology, the factions, and the larger conflicts that will drive the story forward. Characters still exist in their narrative, of course, but they often feel like they are serving the plot rather than the other way around. The story moves from event to event, from conflict to conflict, and the characters react to what is happening around them, but their emotional development sometimes takes a backseat to the larger narrative. That doesn't mean the main story is bad. Larger narratives often need that kind of structure in order to build a bigger world and long-term plot. But it does explain why these smaller character stories sometimes leave a stronger impression. Because they flip the priority. Instead of asking what happens next in the plot, they ask a much simpler question. What is this character going through? And when a story stays focused on that question, it often ends up feeling much more personal. That's exactly what happens with Yvonne's story. It's not trying to move the entire world forward. It's simply following one character as she learns to deal with loss and find a way to move forward again. And sometimes that kind of focused storytelling is exactly what makes a story memorable. And honestly, stories like this are exactly why I enjoy these smaller characters episodes so much. They give the writers the chance to slow down and focus on something that larger narratives often struggle to prioritize: the characters themselves. Instead of pushing the plot forward at full speed, they take a moment to explore what these characters are actually feeling, what they're struggling with, and how those experiences shape them. And when that's done well, even a simple story can leave a much stronger impression than something much bigger. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling discussion, feel free to leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. And if you like breaking down narratives like this, whatever it's gacha stories, web novels, or other serialized fiction, consider subscribing. That's pretty much what this channel is about. I'd also love to hear what you thought about Yvonne's story. Did it hit you as hard as it did for me, or was there another character story in Endfield that you liked even more? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.